class. It's Dr. Miller. I'm here for week 3 of our studies in logic. We've gone through some basics of the vocabulary of logic. We've gone through the building of truth tables. We've looked at some of the key operators, the 5 key operators that we're going to use in symbolic logic. And now we're going to get to some of the basic proofs that are at the heart of symbolic logic. And this is where it gets fun. I know it won't seem fun at first, but trust me, if you stick with it, you'll be excited to see how good you get at doing these kinds of problems. I want to talk a little bit at the beginning here about logic and theology again, because it's fascinating to me how reason and theology cross paths along the way. And there are those people historically who have felt like reason has something to say to theology, and there are those who think it does not. To start with those who think that reason has no bearing on theology, there are people who don't believe in God who think that, and people who do believe in God who think that. People who don't believe in God, or atheists, who say there is no God, think that reason doesn't have anything to say into theology, because if anything, reason demonstrates that there is no God, that you can't know that there's a God out there. Or if they call themselves an agnostic, meaning not knowing, from the Greek gnosis, if they're agnostic, they say that it can't be known. Reason can never get you to a knowledge of God because the existence of God cannot be known. So often people who do not believe in God will say it's because of reason that they do not believe. There are also people who believe in God, but who nonetheless believe that reason has nothing to say into theology. Last week we looked at the Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard, and we talked about how he brought the modern world into an association of faith with a blind leap. That many people now assume that believing in God is a blind leap into commitment without reason for believing. And I told you that's not what Jesus did, that's not what the Bible teaches, but Kierkegaard implied it, and many people in the modern world have decided that's what religious faith is all about. It is choosing to believe without facts. Again, I would tell you that's not the case. But there are those historically who believed in God and nonetheless said reason cannot speak into the world of theology. One of the famous proponents of this view was Karl Barth. Karl Barth was a 20th century theologian who insisted that we only know God because God reveals himself to us in Jesus Christ. And without Jesus, without the direct revelation of God, we are so broken by sin, we suffer so much from depravity that our minds are lost and cannot reason their way to God. God has to reveal himself to us. And furthermore, God has to place his Spirit in us and give us the faith to believe. So it's not so much a blind leap through choice of will, it is a commitment that is given to us by God, as opposed to something we decide upon ourselves. So Karl Barth would say reason cannot lead us to God. That's not where theology comes from. So now we have a case of people who don't believe in God and who say reason has nothing to say, and people who do believe in God and say reason has nothing to say. But I want to look at the other side of the coin as well. There are those who say that reason does point us towards God. And here we're in an area of theology generally known as natural theology. Natural theology looks at the general revelation of God through the natural world and looks for indicators in the natural world that suggest to us that there is a God. The contrast would be a specific revelation through Scripture, which tells us who God is. Instead, the general revelation of God in nature points us towards God, and reason is a subset of that. We all know this experience where you sit at the ocean and you watch a sunset and it's beautiful and it's big, and you look at the stars overhead in the night sky and you think there must be a power out there that brought this to be. Or you look at the moral world in which people make right decisions and honor justice and love people in need, and we think that moral inclination must come from somewhere. That's a natural part of the world that points us towards the existence of God. Immanuel Kant, the great Enlightenment philosopher, said, when I look at the starry world above and the moral world within, I'm convinced that there's a God out there. That's the broad umbrella of natural theology, that we can look at the natural world and then come to conclusions about the existence of God. And in fact, certain philosophers and theologians have tried to catalog the reasons that might lead us to believe in God's existence. One famous theologian who did this is Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas was a medieval philosopher, one of the greats of the High Middle Ages, and he believed that reason could, through what he called 5 proofs, show us that there's a God. And if you read Aquinas' proofs today, they can read a little bit oddly because he's using categories of philosophy that come from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle that we don't quite use so much today. But Aristotle talked, for instance, a lot about causation, about how one thing causes another. Aristotle says there are 4 different kinds of causes in the world, and he talked a lot about causation. Aquinas would draw from Aristotle and say that everything that exists was caused by something that came before it. And so if we look at everything that exists in the world, there's a causal chain that goes back to the beginning. But there has to be something that started it off. And that uncaused cause, or what he calls a first cause, is God. Now that doesn't talk about the God of the Scriptures so much. That's not the God who we see in Jesus Christ. But the idea that there's some creator mind that initiated everything is one of the proofs that Aquinas points towards when he names his 5 proofs for the existence of God. What Aquinas has led to in the modern world is a certain brand of defense of the Christian faith. The defense of the Christian faith is generally called apologetics. That actually comes from a passage in the Bible, in the letters of Peter, in which Peter says you should always be ready with a defense for what you believe, but do so with gentleness and respect. And the Greek word for defense is apologia. You should always have an apologia for what you believe. Now that's not the modern English word apology, because you're not saying, sorry, I believe what I believe. Instead, you're offering a rational defense for what you believe. And that's the Greek word apologia. So there's a modern school of thought, a modern branch of Christian theology called apologetics. And it offers rational defenses for the Christian faith. And within that rational defense, which often is an exploration of natural theology, there's a kind of theology called rationalism, or rational apologetics. And rational apologetics attempts to catalog explanations for the existence of God, or explanations for things in nature that suggest the existence of God. One author who has popularized this kind of apologetics by writing a very easy to read book for the public is Lee Strobel, who wrote a book, The Case for Christ, which has sold all over the world, and many people have read it. A more erudite and academic scholar who writes in the field of apologetics is William Lane Craig. If you've never heard of William Lane Craig before, you might want to start by watching William Lane Craig's debates on YouTube. Craig has traveled around the world over the course of his lifetime and debated with scholars in the fields of philosophy and science, in astrophysics and biology. And the questions he likes to debate are, does the evidence point towards the existence of God? Or does the historical evidence support the story of Jesus in the New Testament? And he knows his material so well that nobody can stand up to him. Nobody shows up for these debates sufficiently prepared to stand up to his very carefully reasoned arguments that he's obviously been through a number of times, and the vast wealth of material and evidence that he brings to the table when he debates. So if you've never watched William Lane Craig before, you might want to watch one of his debates on YouTube. If you like him and you want to dig deeper, you might want to read the book Reasonable Faith. Reasonable Faith is an exploration of arguments for the existence of God. And Craig uses arguments like the argument that for the universe to exist at all, it had to have a cause. Because in the physical material universe, nothing just pops into existence. Matter doesn't just spontaneously occur. It's always caused. And if prior to the Big Bang, the universe was non-existent, I don't mean it was empty space, I mean there was no space, there was nothing. And suddenly the universe had a beginning point. Then something had to initiate that beginning. Craig uses arguments like that, looking at the beginning of the universe and trying to account for it, to say, obviously there's some God out there. Similarly, he looks at the moral argument for the existence of God. He says that we all believe in moral facts. We all believe that there is some objective moral reality. For instance, we all believe that torturing a child for fun is wrong. There's no universe in which that could be permissible. There's no universe in which that could be acceptable. Even if everybody in the world decided it was okay, it would still be wrong. It's not subject to group will. We believe in objective moral facts. And Craig says, through the use of induction and abduction, the most reasonable explanation for objective moral values is the existence of God. Without God, we cannot have objective moral values. We can have moral systems that you and I might contractually agree on, but there's no reason why I shouldn't violate it when I can get away with it if I want to. Objective moral values are different than that. Objective moral values are always right and wrong, regardless of whether or not I agree with them. And Craig says the best explanation for the moral values that we all commit to, that we all hold at some level, is a moral being that created us. That's how a rationalist approach to apologetics works. My own book, Hardwired, explores a kind of rational apologetics. The subtitle is about looking for the God that you already know is there. And my argument is that knowledge and communication itself rely on a moral foundation, and a foundation that's committed to actual meaning. And if we have evolution alone, without a creator, on blind chance and mutation, adaptation and survival of the fittest, there's no way we can arrive at a place where we truly believe in meaning and the intellectual morality required for us to have basic communication. That only comes if there's a God behind it. So much so that when an atheist argues against the existence of God, the atheist is using principles that require the existence of God. And that's my book, Hardwired. It's another instance of rational apologetics. All that to say, in this very long introduction to today's lecture, there's good reason to believe that logic plays a role in coming to the theological conclusions that we do. If we want to explore whether or not a rational person can come to believe in God, God wouldn't fault us for doing that. The scriptures teach that we should love God with all our hearts, with all our souls, and with all our minds. And to love God with your mind means you love the truth. And you go exploring the world looking for truth. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans chapters 1 through 3 that though we are broken by sin, nonetheless, God's invisible qualities, his power and divine nature, are made plain to us so that we're without excuse for not believing. It's clear that there is a God. He'll say in the book of Acts chapter 17, Luke records him debating with the Athenian philosophers, and he says, God has done what he has done so that we'll reach out for him and find him, because God is not far from any one of us. Acts 17:27. The Bible invites us to rationally explore the existence of God. And anybody who believes in the truth and the power of reason, the power of logic, should happily embrace the possibility that an exploration of the truth might lead us to the God who started it all. So that's my introduction for today. Let's get to work. Today we're going to look at the 18 different arguments that we're going to build upon to do most of our problem solving in symbolic logic. I hope you enjoy this as much as I do. And now, using the wonders of modern technology, we're going to work our way through some of the proofs that we're going to use to analyze and break down all the arguments we look at in this course. The first one is one we've already talked about before. It's called Modus Ponens. That's a fancy way of naming this style of argument, the structure of argument that we've used before. Again, it goes this way. If it is raining outside, then I will carry an umbrella. Premise number two, it's raining outside. Conclusion, I will carry an umbrella. That's a foundational proof that's going to be used to build up to all of our other proofs. We're going to end up with some very long sentences broken down into the atoms of the symbolic language that we're then going to prove or demonstrate that the validity of them by breaking them down into these foundational proofs that we're going to use. There are about 18 foundational proofs we're going to use. Modus ponens is the first one. And when you identify a line of an argument that uses modus ponens, you label that using the lines from which the atoms are drawn, in this case, premise 1 and premise 2, and then you write the letter MP for modus ponens out to the side. And that's how you demonstrate in a proof that you know how you got to this step. You'll see this over and over again as we go. And it'll make more and more sense as we practice it over and over again. That's modus ponens. The second one we're going to look at is called modus tollens. Now, modus tollens is very similar, but you have to think through it in full sentences to understand how it's working. Modus tollens goes this way. If P, then Q. Not Q, therefore not P. So let's turn this into an English sentence. Premise number 1, if it's raining outside, then I will carry an umbrella. Premise number 2, I'm not carrying an umbrella. Therefore, we know it's not raining outside. Now that should intuitively make sense, but it's important to distinguish that from a mistake in argumentation that people often make, which goes this way. If it's raining outside, then I will carry an umbrella. I'm carrying an umbrella, therefore it's raining outside. Now that's false. That actually doesn't work. That's called assuming the antecedent. It's a fallacy. And the reason it doesn't work is I might be somebody who carries an umbrella everywhere I go, rain or shine. And so the fact that it's raining actually has no bearing on whether or not I carry an umbrella. So the fact that the consequent is true doesn't prove that the antecedent is true. But if the antecedent is false, then we know, if the consequent is false, then we know that the antecedent is false. So again, modus tollens works this way. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And the way you would label that, if you were analyzing an argument when we're doing our problem solving in our homework, is you would say line 1 is premise, so we just put P out to the right of that. Line 2 is also a premise, it's what's given to us. Line 3, you would write MT for modus tollens, and then line 1 and line 2. Those are two of the most basic, fundamental, foundational forms of argumentation that we're going to use in symbolic logic. You need to understand those first and foremost. You need to understand why we're using them and what we're doing with them. If it's still a little bit fuzzy because symbolic logic is a whole new world to you, that's okay. But you need to understand how these arguments work because we're going to build a lot on these simple foundations. A third kind of argument that we're going to look at is called the hypothetical syllogism. A hypothetical syllogism is sort of similar to modus ponens, but this one allows us to combine two conditional premises. So for instance, premise 1, if P then Q. And I'd of course write out to the right P for premise. Premise number 2, if Q then R. And I'd write out to the right hand side premise. Conclusion, if P then R. Now you can see the elegant simplicity of this. You can see why this works. If it's raining outside, then I'll carry an umbrella. If I'm carrying an umbrella, then I'll stay dry. Conclusion, if it's raining outside, then I'll stay dry. And those follow naturally and necessarily from the structure of this argument. You would label this one, when you come to this in the line of an argument, HS for hypothetical syllogism, and then put the lines from which you got it, lines, in this case, 1 and 2. Understand what we're doing here? Okay, that's 3 building blocks of argumentation, of proofs of arguments that we already have. Modus ponens, modus tollens, and the hypothetical syllogism. Let me give you a couple easy ones, and then we'll build into some harder ones. Number 4 is called conjunction. This one, again, is pretty simple. If I have 2 atoms that I know are both true, then I can combine them with a conjunction. So premise number 1, P. Premise number 2, Q. Conclusion, P and Q. And then I'd write out to the right-hand side, CONJ for conjunction, and the lines from which I got it, 1 and 2. We can take the 2 things that we know are true and we can combine them. That doesn't work with disjunction. You can't combine 2 things that are separated by an or, but it works with conjunction. If we know 2 atoms are true, we can combine them and say they're both true. You'll see why this is so useful later on. Okay, that's 4 arguments, 4 proofs of arguments that we've got. The next one is similar to conjunction, except it's in reverse. If we have a conjunction of 2 atoms that we know are true, P and Q, we can derive from that 2 separate things. We can derive P and we can derive Q. So it's not uncommon in one of these proofs that we're going to be building to have a conjunction as a premise, P and Q. That's line 1, that's our premise. And then to have a first conclusion, P, which we derive by what we call simplification. We can draw P from it and call that simplification. And then have line 3 be Q, which we also call simplification. And we draw both of those from line 1 from the premise. So that's called simplification, and it is the opposite of conjunction. And that's another foundational building block of our proofs. Let's look at one called the disjunctive syllogism. Disjunctive syllogism is a mouthful. Disjunctive syllogism comes about when we have a disjunction, P or Q. That's our first premise. The second premise is to assert that one of the 2 atoms is false. So for instance, not P. The conclusion is therefore Q. Now we know this is true if we go back and look at the truth tables for the disjunction. For the disjunction, one of the 2 atoms has to be true. Either P is true, or Q is true, or they're both true, but they can't both be false. So if one of them is false, the other one is necessarily true. So if P is false, Q has to be true. Q has to be true. Or we can use the disjunctive syllogism in reverse, and we could say P or Q, not Q, therefore P. That's the disjunctive syllogism. The next one we're going to look at is called a constructive dilemma. This one's a little bit more complex when you look at it, but it makes sense. Line number 1, P or Q. That's our premise. Line number 2, if P, then R. Line number 3, if Q, then S. Conclusion, R or S. Because if either P or Q are true, then those 2 conditionals require that one of the two consequence is going to be true. We know that one of the two antecedents is true. Either P or Q is true, which means one of those is going to cause the consequent to be true. Either R or S is going to be true. So we can derive R or S from the three premises. That is called the constructive dilemma. Finally, we're going to look at one called addition. And I saved this one till last, though it is not the hardest one, but students tend to be confused by this one, and they tend to be reticent to use it because they're afraid it's cheating. This one is simply that you can use disjunction to add something to something you already know is true. So for instance, if I have the premise P, then I can add as a conclusion P or Q. Because for P or Q to be true, only one of the two atoms has to be true. And I already know P is true. So I can add anything I want to P as a disjunction, and it will still be valid. I can add P or Q, P or R, P or S. It doesn't really matter, because only one of the two elements has to be true for it to be valid. This seems like cheating, but I can give you an example in an English sentence of how this works. Let's say I begin with the premise, the sky is blue. That's a fact. Now, in a disjunction, only one of the two elements has to be true. So I'm going to say the sky is blue or, and then I can fill in anything else. And only one of the two atoms has to be true. And the sky is blue is always going to be true. So I can say the sky is blue or elephants are pink. I can say the sky is blue or I love you. I can say the sky is blue or the world will end tomorrow. It doesn't really matter what I put in there. I can put something nonsensical in there. The sky is blue or there are square triangles. The second half can be absolutely false. As long as the first atom is true, the disjunction is true. So that's how addition works. And I signify that in a proof by adding ADD and then noting the line from which the true atom came. Now those are the first 8 building blocks of our proofs. Make sure you have those down, and let's do a few problems and see if we can sort through those and use those to build proofs. Let's look at a few lines of an argument and see if we can explain where each of the lines came from in terms of proofs. Let's begin with a 5-step argument with 3 premises. Premise number 1 is if A, then B. Premise number 2 is A or C. Premise number 3 is not B. All right, the first line, which draws a conclusion from the 3 premises, is line 4, and line 4 concludes not A. How do you think we might get line 4? What proof might we be using to determine that? Well, you see we have a not B in there. And you see we have if A, then B. Do you remember how Modus Tollens works? If we have not B, and we have a conditional, then we know that the antecedent, A, is also false. And that's line 4. So we'd signify that by writing MT for Modus Tollens, and then writing 1 and 3 to signify the lines from which we derived it. Then line 5 says C. How would we conclude C? Well, premise 2 said A or C. And you remember in a disjunction, one of the two has to be true. But we just concluded on line 4, not A. So if A is false, then in the disjunction, C has to be true. And what was the proof that we used to determine that? It was the disjunctive syllogism, right? If one of the two elements of a disjunction is false, the other one has to be true. So we would write DS and use lines 2 and 4 to derive that. See how that works? That was a simple and straightforward one. Let me give you another one. Premise number 1. If A, then B. Premise number 2. If B, then C. Premise number 3. Not C. So that's what's given to us. Well, what can we do with that? Line 4 is if A, then C. What might we have used to conclude that in the 3 premises? Well, we have if A, then B, and if B, then C. Remember, with concluding if A, then C from that is called the hypothetical syllogism. That's one of our proofs. So that would be the source of line 4. And we'd write HS for hypothetical syllogism, and the 2 lines from which we drew it, line 1 and line 2. Let's say line 5 is not A. Where would that come from? Well, I think you can see it pretty quickly. We have not C as our 3rd premise. And we just concluded in line 4, if A, then C. This is again a case of modus tollens. If the consequent is negated, then the antecedent is false. If it's not raining outside, then I'm not carrying an umbrella. So we conclude not A from lines 3 and 4, and we label it modus tollens. You understand what we're doing here? Shouldn't be too complicated, should be pretty straightforward. Let's do a couple more. Premise number 1, A or, parentheses, H and K. That's premise number 1. These are getting a little more complex, you see. We're starting to add multiple atoms to a single line. A or H and Q. Line number 2, if A, then, parentheses, B or C. Line number 3, 3rd premise, not, parentheses, B or C. Well, you might see where this is going already. Line 4 is going to be not A. How would we get not A from the 3 premises? Well, we're going to use modus tollens again. We've negated B or C, and that's the consequent of line 2. So you can negate not just an atom, but a collection of atoms that are inside a parenthesis. So not B or C negates the consequent of line 2, which then negates the antecedent, which is A. So that gives us line 4, not A, using modus tollens from lines 2 and 3. We can then derive H and Q in line 5. How do we derive H and Q in line 5? Well, you see H and Q grouped in parentheses up in the 1st premise. And it's a disjunction with A. Well, we already concluded in line 4, not A. And we know from our disjunctive syllogism that if one of the elements of a disjunction is false, the other one has to be true. And so again, the fact that it's 2 atoms in parentheses doesn't stop it from being an entire atom itself. And so if we know not A, then we know H and Q is true. And that's how we conclude that one. I hope you're making sense of these and that they're ringing pretty true. If you and I were in a classroom together, we could draw these up on a marker board and work them out and take turns doing them and ask questions. You're just having to do it in a slightly different way in this digital age. But if you have questions, if any of this is confusing to you, don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Send me an email or even send a message here if you'd like. And let's talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it. Let's look at another one. Number 4. Parentheses, this is premise number 1, parentheses, H or Q, then L. So this is a conditional, and the antecedent is 2 atoms grouped together. But those 2 together make an antecedent. Premise number 2, if M, then not L. Premise number 3, M. Well, line 4, you should figure out really quickly what that's going to be. We have in premise number 2, if M then not L, and we're given M. So you know by modus ponens, we're going to come up with not L. Pretty quickly out of this proof, that's what we would derive. So line 4 is not L using modus ponens from lines 2 and 3. Line 5 is then going to be not, parentheses, H or Q, which remember was the antecedent in line 1. And here we have a conditional, H or Q, then L, and we know the consequent is false because we already derived not L, which means the antecedent is also false. What's that called? That's modus tollens. Modus tollens derived from line 1 and line 4. These are pretty easy in the scope of symbolic logic. We're going to get into some problems that are a mile long by the time this course is over. So hopefully these are pretty simple and straightforward to you. Let's do another one. Premise number 1, D or E. Premise number 2, if D, then not A. Premise number 3, not E. And premise number 4, A or B. And in case you're wondering, there can be an unlimited number of premises in any argument, but if we're working from premises to a conclusion, at some point the premises must stop. In this case, there are 4 of them. Line 5 is then the conclusion, D. And that probably should have jumped out at you pretty quickly because in line 3 we have not E, and in line 1 we have a disjunction, D or E. So remember, given the disjunctive syllogism, if one of the elements of a disjunction is false, the other one's true. So line 5 we conclude disjunctive syllogism, 1 and 3, D. Line number 6 is not A. That one should be pretty straightforward to you. We just decided in line 5 that D was true, and we have the conditional up in line 2, if D then not A. So not A is derived by modus ponens. And then finally line 7 is B. Where do we get B from? Well, we've derived not A, and we see in line 4 A or B. And we know in a disjunction, because of the disjunctive syllogism, if one element of the disjunction is false, the other one is true. And so B is true. I hope these are making sense to you and are pretty straightforward. This is just scratching the surface of symbolic logic and proofs. So if these are seeming easy to you, don't get overconfident. It's going to get more complicated as we go. Let me now give you some harder ones using more of the arguments that we've built. Now bear in mind, I've only given you 8 of these arguments so far. We're going to go through 18 before this class is done. But today I just want to get through these 8 and let you practice some problems using these 8. Let me start with one that's kind of funny. It's only 2 lines long. Line 1, the premise is D and R. Line 2, the conclusion is parentheses D and R or brackets A or parentheses B and D. Close parentheses, close brackets. What happened there? How did you get from line 1, that simple premise, to that confusing conclusion? This one is addition. Remember, addition looks like cheating because you can add a whole bunch of junk to something that you already know is true, and it doesn't matter what the junk consists of. You can put some brackets up there and fill it with all the things you want to. And it doesn't matter if the first element of the disjunction was already true, it doesn't matter what you add in there. So that one is a case of addition. Let's look at another one. Number 1, premise 1. Brackets, if L, then parentheses, B, then A, close parentheses, close brackets. And parentheses, L or M. Line 2, if L, then parentheses, if B, then A. Now this is a one-step proof. Again, all you have to do is look back through the 8 proofs that we've used, the 8 arguments that we've used to decide how we could get from the premise to the conclusion. And this is a case of simplification. Remember, if you have a conjunction as a premise, you can take either element of that conjunction and derive it on its own line using simplification. So we'd say simplification from line 1. Let's get a little bit more complex. Okay, here's a harder way. Premise number 1, if A, then D. Premise number 2, parentheses, B and C, then H. Premise number 3, if D, then parentheses, B and C. Those three premises are then going to give us 2 more lines. Line number 4, if A, then B and C. Where do you think that comes from? It might take you a minute to look back through the premises, and remember, it doesn't have to be 2 premises that are adjacent to each other. It doesn't have to be from 1 or 2. It can be from any of them. What we're using there is line 1 and line 3. If A, then D. If D, then B and C. Therefore, if A, then B and C. That's a hypothetical syllogism, and we'd say that's drawn from lines 1 and 3. Line 5 is then, if A, then H. You have if A, then B and C, and if B and C, then H, so we can then derive if A, then H. And that is another case of the hypothetical syllogism. You can also use each of the proofs as many times as you need. Let's do a harder one still with more lines. Premise number 1, if A, then if B, then D. Premise number 2, not D. Premise number 3, D or A. So you should pretty quickly be able to see we can combine premises 2 and 3 there to draw a conclusion out of those. Line number 4 then, and those are the 3 premises. We're now drawing conclusions. Line 4 is A. Where did we get that? From the disjunctive syllogism based on lines 2 and 3. If D is not true, A must be. Line 5 is going to be if B, then D. Look back at line 1. It says if A, then B, then D. And we now know that A is true, so therefore, combining lines 4 and 1, if B, then D is true. Line number 6, not D. You should have been able to see, not B. You should have been able to see this one coming because line 2 was the only line left we hadn't used. Now sometimes when problems are really tricky, there will be some premises in there that don't get used, that are just there to throw you off, but not usually. So if line 2 is the only line we haven't used, we're probably going to use it here. And if not D is true, and according to line 5, if B then D, then remember, according to Modus Tollens, not B is our conclusion. So you see what we do here. We get into more and more complex proofs as we go, building towards more interesting conclusions as we get deeper into symbolic logic. Here's a longer problem. It's 8 steps long. This proof is 8 steps long, and we're only given 3 premises. So premise number 1, if A, then B. Premise number 2, A and not D. Premise number 3, if B, then C. All right. The next line is A. How can you get A out of those 3 premises? Well, line 2 is a conjunction. And using simplification, we can take either element out of a conjunction. So we're going to take A out of there and call it simplification from line 2. We're then going to say if A, then C. That's combining lines 1 and 3 using a hypothetical syllogism. If A, then B, and if B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. Line 6 is C. That's using modus ponens from the previous 2 lines. If A, then C, and we have A, therefore C. Line 7 is not D. That again is simplification from our conjunction in line 2. You can use you can derive things from the premises in any order that you want. And so we're going back and deriving simplification out of premise 2. We could have done that immediately, but we've just waited and gotten around to it later. And then finally, line 8, C and not D. How do we get that? It's a conjunction of the previous two lines. That should give you a pretty good feel of how these problems work. And if you're in my class at the university, this is what your homework is going to look like. Now we're going to get into building some real arguments. And you're going to do some of these on your own in your homework. This one is a bit more challenging, but it's fun to do. Let me give you an example here. What's going to happen is the problems are going to give you the premises that you can assume, and then they're going to tell you the conclusion that you need to get to, and you have to figure out all the steps on your own. So for instance, let's say premise number 1. Premise number 1, parentheses, R and A or E. Premise number 2, R and A, then D. Premise number 3, not D. And what we want to conclude is E and not D. So this takes some creativity. When you first start working on logic, it feels like it's entirely rational deduction. But it takes some creativity. It takes the artistic side of your brain to think about where to begin and how to creatively problem solve when you look at a problem like this. Well, what do we want in the conclusion? We want E and not D, and we already have not D. That's our third premise. So what we need to do is figure out how to derive E. Well, using not D, we see in line 2, in our second premise, that we have D as a consequent. And if we have not D as its own premise, then you should probably clue in pretty quick that we can use modus tollens there to negate the antecedent. And so we can derive not R and A as line 4 using modus tollens from premise 3 and premise 2. If we have not R and A, then we go back to line 1, which again is the only line we haven't used yet, and we realize that we've negated half of a disjunction. If you negate half of a disjunction, then the other half has to be true, which, remember, is our disjunctive syllogism. So that gives us E. If not R and A, then E, based on a disjunctive syllogism. And now we have what we need. We have E, and we have not D. And so the next line allows us to draw the conclusion that we want, and we simply have to label how we got this. It's a conjunction of our third premise and the E that we concluded. Those are the kinds of problems you're going to have on your homework. You'll be given premises and a conclusion, and you'll have to build the proof yourself. It takes a pretty strong familiarity with the 8 proofs that we've used, and it takes some creativity to look at the premises and decide where you have to go first and what you have to do in order to derive what you're looking for. Let's look at another one. Premise number 1, A. Premise number 2, B or C, then D. Premise number 3, A or E, then B and C. And what we're trying to conclude is D. Well, that one's a little bit more complex, and you have to look at that one for a few minutes and think about it. We're trying to conclude D, and D is the end of the conditional in line 2. So if we get B or C, then we have D. Well, where might we get B or C from? Well, we have B and C in the third conditional. That doesn't really help us. And we have A or E, and we have A. So that's confusing. How on earth would we get to that? Well, if we get A or E, then we can get B and C. that looks like we might be needing to head in that direction. So let's say line 4, A or E. Remember, it feels like cheating. It's called addition. We just stuck an E in there. But we get to do that because we know that A is already true. So now we know that A or E is true. That allows us in line 5 to conclude B and C. That's a simple case of modus ponens. We have the antecedent, we can draw the consequent. Now we have B and C, and we want to get to D. Well, you can withdraw from the conjunction B and C, B. B is simplification. And so now we have B. But we want to get B or C. How do we get there? Well, again, we get to cheat. We simply add C back in through addition. B or C is a valid step. And that then leads us to the conclusion, to D, through modus ponens. That's a more complex problem in terms of the number of steps it takes, but it's pretty straightforward. The creative step comes when you strategize about where to begin. And you really just have to look at the problem for a while and think, what can I do with these various parts? It kind of reminds me of a toy that my kids used to play with when they were little. It was a cube-shaped box with lots of holes in all the sides. And each of the holes was in the shape of a certain piece that went through that hole. There was a star-shaped hole and a star-shaped piece that went through it. There was a round hole and a round-shaped piece that went through it. A square hole and a square-shaped piece that went through it. And what this did was it taught children manual dexterity in shapes by prompting them to place the right shapes through the right holes in order to get them all inside the cube. That's kind of how we do with these proofs. You look at the various premises that are given and ask which of the premises or parts of the premises look like they'll fit well with one of the other premises. How might they be combined to draw something out of them? Sometimes you're just going to be shooting in the dark, and you're going to take a premise and just derive from it whatever you can, not necessarily knowing the next step. You'll see a conjunction in the premises, B and C, and you'll think, well, I'm going to add a line that has B on it and a line that has C on it through simplification. I don't know if I need B or C yet, but I'm going to go ahead and write those down because that'll give me more lines to stare at and think about creatively as I figure out which peg goes through which hole. That's really the strategy to solving these problems, and sometimes it just takes some long contemplation. Sometimes you'll have to ask for help as you learn how to do it, but the more you do it, the more familiar these steps will become. I'll give you one very interesting way that logic and argumentation have come to play out in the world of theology in recent years. There's an argument that was built by an analytic philosopher at Notre Dame named Alvin Plantinga. And Alvin Plantinga is a Christian, but he's also a brilliant philosopher. And he uses the skills of philosophy to bring a fascinating argumentation into the world of theology. He built an argument that was so provocative that entire books have been written by other philosophers about this one little paper that Plantinga wrote. And Plantinga's argument is an argument about evolution and naturalism. He calls it the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And the way this argument works is he looks at the premises of evolution. Evolution says that humanity evolved through a process of blind chance, that is mutation, and then adaptation through those mutations to the environment, and then survival of the fittest. Those who are most fit are most likely to reproduce and multiply the adaptations that are most advantageous to survival. Now bear in mind, none of this is done through intention. The environment is the active agent here, and all it does is kill off the weak. Not because it has a mind, none of this is conscious. But things mutate with no intention of mutating. They don't think about it, they just do it. The environment then decides whether or not the mutation is advantageous or waste, and it kills off the waste, allowing the strongest, the most adapted, to survive. Again, none of this is intentional. The living being that is adapting is not thinking it wants to survive. It doesn't matter what it thinks. It only matters that the environment wipes out disadvantageous mutations. Well, Plantinga looks at that and says, okay, that's the evolutionary explanation for life. But then he looks at a philosophical worldview called naturalism. And naturalism is the belief that the natural world is all that exists. It argues that there is no God. There is a physical universe, there are forces within it, but it's all natural and nothing else. If naturalism is the case, and if evolution is the case, we end up with a conflict between the two. If there is no God, then evolution did its work without any intention behind it. There was no grand mind moving it along. It was just a string of accidents. As a consequence, everything that has evolved solely for the purpose of survival. It has not evolved through a conscious process of thinking about what's best. It simply survived and survived and survived. That includes all elements of life, including the human mind. The brain, the mind, are just a product of a long process of mutation, natural selection, adaptation, and survival of the fittest. Now, we naturally assume that the mind has evolved to perceive truth because we think that lends itself to survival. That assumption is false. It might be that we could evolve some very helpful mental errors. For instance, if I perceive the world as being a little bit more dangerous than it actually is, in other words, if I'm a little bit paranoid, it might cause me to defend myself even more, to take extra precautions to make sure that I survive better. It's an advantageous mistake. If I perceive wrongly that the world is more dangerous than it really is, I might do a better job at surviving. And so we have every reason to believe that our minds would evolve to perceive falsehoods in order to lend themselves to survival. Because of that, we really can't trust any of the thoughts coming out of our minds. We never know when one of our thoughts is actually a perception of truth or reality, and when our thoughts are simply adaptations for the sake of survival. There's no way to get outside the mind and look at it and decide what is advantageous and what is actually a perception of objective reality. We never have access to that distinction. And so all of our thoughts are then suspect. As a consequence, all of our philosophies and beliefs are suspect. And naturalism is a belief. It's a philosophy. And that belief is therefore suspect. If I can't trust the mind to necessarily perceive truth because the mind has only evolved to survive, then any of the ideas the mind carries around in it are suspect. I can't prove that any of them are actual perceptions of objective truth. That includes my belief in naturalism. So if evolution is true, I cannot believe in naturalism. Ironically, the belief that the world evolved through natural causes without God is self-defeating. It's a worldview that collapses in on itself because the antecedent negates the consequence. The consequent. The fact that it is not raining outside means I can't be sure why I'm carrying an umbrella or if I'm carrying one or not. The fact that naturalism rests on evolution, that evolution depends on naturalism, all comes collapsing down when we realize evolution undermines naturalism. Plantinga's argument, which he wrote in the 1990s, was so provocative that, as I said, philosophers all over the place began writing rejections of it and arguments against it, including entire books that are collections of essays trying to reject Plantinga's naturalistic argument against evolution, or evolutionary argument against naturalism, either way. That structure of argument has now found its way into the world of moral thinking. It's getting, again, close to theology, because now we're not just dealing with whether or not evolution can be true, we're dealing with whether or not morals can be objective facts. And a woman named Sharon Street in 2006, I think it was, wrote a brilliant essay about a Darwinian dilemma surrounding moral facts. Moral facts, remember, are objective truths. When we believe that it is morally wrong in all cases to torture a child for fun, that is a moral fact. It's not subjective. It's not an opinion. It doesn't depend on majority will. Even if everybody disagrees with it, it's still a fact. That's an objective moral principle, a moral fact. Well, Sharon Smart uses planting as structure, planting as argumentation, to show that we're in trouble again. Because if evolution accounts for the development of the brain, and the mind only exists for the sake of survival, then the contents of the mind are themselves suspect. And moral facts are just philosophies and ideas contained in the mind. We therefore can never be sure that our moral beliefs exist for any reason other than survival. That when I believe that we shouldn't torture a child for fun, it's not because there's an actual moral fact there. It's simply because I'm wired through a process of millions of years of evolution to believe that protecting children will propagate my genetic matter further through the gene pool. So I give it this moral weight. I say that there's a weighty condemnation to doing wrong here, but in fact, evolution has undermined the contents of my brain, including moral facts. So as a consequence of this Darwinian dilemma, I can no longer claim that there are moral facts in the world. Now, Sharon Street doesn't say this for any explicitly theological reason. I don't even know if Sharon Street is a religious person. But it plays pretty well into the hands of Christians, who are happy to say that if there are moral facts out there, there has to be a God behind them and underpinning them in order for them to be true. You pull God out of the equation, you no longer have morality. And this jives with what a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche was saying 100 years ago, 120 years ago. Nietzsche said that God is dead and we have killed him. And as a consequence, we need to have a re-evaluation, a reassessing of all of our values. Judeo-Christian morality had been pulled out from under the Western culture, the Western European and American culture. And as a consequence, we had all kinds of moral beliefs resting on a Judeo-Christian foundation. When the foundation is gone, the morals are now suspect and up for grabs. As Dostoevsky said several decades before Nietzsche, if God is dead, everything is permissible. And those are the consequences of logical contemplation about theology and the natural world. I hope you find that helpful and interesting. I certainly do. I'll see you next week.